John Hook's Newsmaker Saturday starts now.
And thanks for joining us on Newsmaker Saturday. I'm Christina Carilla in tonight for John Hook. Later in tonight's program, we're talking about veterans coming home from deployment, suffering from toxic exposure to burn pits. There's legislation that could help them get the treatment they need if it gets enough votes. We'll talk about that later. But first, a different kind of hardship facing parents across the country right now. The baby formula shortage. How do we get here and when will it get better? That's the question. So joining me now to talk about this, Dale Rogers, ASU professor and someone who has studied and knows supply chain management and logistics. He's studied it for a very long time, all throughout his career. Dale, thanks for being here.
Nice to be with you again.
So let's walk this back to the beginning, if you will. So in February, Abbott Nutrition, at the center of all this, one of the few main companies that produces baby formula in our country, shut down their plant in Sturgis, Michigan with the FDA. After Chronobacter bacteria was found in their product, 4 children got sick, 2 died, and then the federal investigation ensued. But this brought everything to a standstill. Shelves now are empty. And I want to go back to that part about how few companies control the supply of baby formula in this country. Why is that?
Well, there's a few reasons. One, just in general, most industries sort of have what we call the rule of 3. There's usually 3 companies that really dominate whatever industry. It's kind of a natural selection. You know, in 1900, you had 60 automobile companies all around Detroit. By 1960, you had 3. So it's sort of a natural evolution progression. Another reason for the fact that the industry is quite concentrated is that baby formula is a controlled substance, controlled by the FDA, very similar to how drugs are, pharmaceuticals are. And so that also creates barriers to entry into the baby formula business. Another piece of this, and this number might sound big, but it really isn't, the entire baby formula market in the United States is about $4 billion a year. That's not that big of a business, but it's a terribly important business. You know, for a mom, that seems like a really important thing to be able to get to. But for the 3 big companies that control most of the baby formula manufacturing in the United States, you know, baby formula is not a big part of their business. For Abbott, who you mentioned already, that had the plant go down, it's about 5% of their business. So it's important, but it's not really the main thing that they do. One of the other 3 companies is Gerber, which is a part of Nestle, you know, the gigantic Swiss company. And, you know, baby formula isn't really bigger than candy bars, truthfully. So it's a small business for all of those companies. You tend to have industries move to a limited number of players. And then it's also a protected industry. The third issue here is that it's protected. You know, when the Trump administration renegotiated NAFTA, they wanted to keep out subsidized industries that came from Mexico or Canada. Well, in Canada, the dairy industry is subsidized by the Canadian government. And so the USMCA put big tariffs on Canadian dairy products, and dairy products from Canada were a large component, past tense, really, to baby formula. So we had a whole bunch of things happen at the same time. Right. And then the tipping point was the plant in Michigan going down.
Yeah, and they carry one of those most popular products in baby formula, the Similac, which of course many people use. So when that went down, we saw such a big impact from that. But White House officials, they say they have increased production now by 30%. They sped up operations by 40%. They're doing things to help. On May 18th, the president announced invoking the Defense Production Act, also Operation Fly Formula, bringing formula here from other countries under high security. Is this enough? We're not seeing it yet in stores, enough of an impact for people to really feel like, okay, I'm comfortable, I'm getting enough formula now. I think people are still concerned about this. Are they doing enough?
I don't think so. You really have to think, really the last two administrations, both the Trump administration and the Biden administration, they've both been really fairly incompetent around supply chain issues. I'm not really talking about the politics here. They just really haven't jumped on some of these issues as well as they could have. This baby formula problem, you could see the beginnings of it back in January. And the Biden administration completely missed it. And I think President Biden mentioned yesterday that he didn't know anything about it until April. That's really kind of late.
Yeah, I want to play, Dale, I want to play that sound. So people have been critical of this administration and not acting fast enough. Here's what President Biden had to say to that.
Here's the deal. I became aware of this problem sometime after April, in early April, about how intense it was. And so we did everything in our power from that point on.
I guess my question, my response to that is, if all this started in February, right? We knew about this. Children were falling ill with this bacteria. 2 died. And we know how much supply this factory in particular is responsible for in this country. They didn't think this dramatic drop off in supply would happen?
Well, they should have, but there's not really an Office of Supply Chain Management in the United States, and I'm an old supply chain professor, and I think there probably should be. Think about how many shortages we've really seen. Look at the amount of inflation that is mostly caused by broken supply chains and shortages. The reason why prices have gone up so much is partly because of the Fed and a lot of money in the economy. But the biggest issue, if you think about supply demand curves from first year in college, the supply has been broken, so the price goes up. So we've really missed a bunch of these. Now the thing about baby formula, that one's much more serious because you've got babies either living or dying based on access to formula. The numbers are just amazing. So in the first 3 months, half of the babies are on formula. By 6 months old, 3/4, 75% are using formula. This is a pretty important product, and we should have people watching the supply of this. It's really inexcusable, I think.
As of this point, Abbott, the plant there in Michigan, has not reopened. They plan to open in the coming days. At least that's what we're hearing. How long will it take before things get back to normal?
Well, I think before you start seeing the formula on the shelves that are coming out of that plant, obviously people are really scrambling to increase production, and we are starting to import product. I think those big airplanes full of formula are mostly for show. It's not making a huge dent in the supply shortage, but it's something, so that's good. But I would guess 3 to 4 weeks before you see the output of that plant, with fully stocked shelves throughout the country. And I'm thinking probably mid-July before things are back to normal.
Dale, what is the fix for this so this doesn't happen again? Is there something we can do to mitigate this in the future?
I think all of the CEOs of the companies could see this coming. I mean, this is not very surprising that this happened. We really need to understand. We need to map our strategic supply chains. Infant formula is just one thing. There's a bunch of broken supply chains, and we really need to know where these things are coming from, because it's kind of an obscure art a little bit. There's an old saying, never introduce your supplier to your customer, because then you might get skipped out of it. So a lot of companies don't really want to reveal who their suppliers are. And really, we need some openness around where is all this stuff coming from. Yeah. For the most part, the USMCA agreement that was negotiated during the Trump administration has been a great thing. But in this case, it's not helping us right now, right? Because we got these tariffs on Canadian dairy at the same time that the Chinese are building plants in Canada, because Chinese consumers had a really bad thing a few years ago. There was actually executives of the dairy company were executed because of some really bad things that happened there. And Chinese consumers really prefer Canadian dairy products. So we've also got competition for some of the components of formula. We really need to be able to see where things are coming from and have rational regulations around those supply chain flows.
All right. Dale Rogers, always appreciate your time. ASU professor and expert in supply chain management. I appreciate it. Thank you. We're back after this on Newsmaker Saturday. Welcome back to Newsmaker Saturday. We just had Memorial Day, remembering those who paid the ultimate sacrifice for this country. But many veterans who made it home from their deployments are faced with a health crisis here at home. The VA estimates nearly 500,000 troops were exposed to toxic burn pits while serving in Afghanistan and Iraq, and now they're paying the price for it. But there's a bill heading to the Senate right now that could help these veterans. It's called the Honoring Our Pact Act. And joining me now, Jeremy Butler, CEO of the group IAVA, Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America. Jeremy, thanks for being here with us.
Thank you, Christina. It's great to be on the show and be able to talk about this important issue.
I appreciate it. We'll talk about the legislation in just a moment. But first, tell us a little bit about your background as well. You're a veteran, you've served this country, and now you're doing the work as well with IAVA.
Correct. Yeah, I'm a Navy veteran, joined back in 1999, planned on doing about a 4-year tour and getting out, and then was on my first deployment on 9/11. And what started out as a plan of just having a few years of traveling around and getting to see the world, that turned into ultimately still an ongoing career. I came off active duty about 6-7 years later, and I'm still in the reserves, in the Navy Reserves today.
Yeah, I want to talk about burn pits. That's kind of at the center of this right now. More than 80% of post 9/11 veterans who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, they say they've had contact with these toxic burn pits, this waste that's being exposed into the air. Can you talk about what they are for people who don't know?
Yeah, they were, in the simplest terms, they were the military's way of disposing of every single thing that was generated on these bases in Iraq and Afghanistan. So you're talking all of the trash that comes out in day-to-day living, to include medical waste, animal remains, all of your plastics, broken down vehicles, spent ammunition. Literally everything that is generated in a war zone was dumped into one of these massive pits, some of them as large as multiple football fields, multiple acres in size. And then they were covered in jet fuel, and they were burned around the clock, 24/7, 365 days a year. It was a nonstop operation. And as you can see from the clips that you're showing, they just emit the most toxic, noxious black smoke that then every single service member has to live, eat, breathe, sleep 24/7. They're surrounded by this. And so if you were stationed at one of these bases, you could not escape the results of these burn pits.
So essentially what's happening is these veterans, they've served their country and then they go home, and then years later, months later, years later, they're suffering from these illnesses. They go to their doctor and they find out they have a digestive issue, something GI, a cancer. What kind of illnesses are they getting? What's happening with them?
It's a range of illnesses, and it's everything, as you said, from breathing issues, skin issues, to on the more extreme issues, on the extreme end, literally cancers, brain cancers, breast cancer, lung cancers. And for many veterans, they don't even realize the connection. They don't even think about it. And so part of this has just been raising awareness amongst veterans that they need to make sure that they're getting themselves checked out, because it really is. John Stewart described it best. He said the burn pit exposure was like an IED that was placed in your body back when you were in Iraq or Afghanistan, and it could go off 1, 2, 5, 10 years later. And so we're seeing more and more of that. And that's why it was so critical that we talked about this on the Memorial Day weekend, because we've already lost so many veterans to the exposures that they received from burn pits that resulted in cancers and other illnesses down the line.
Yeah, we hear about veterans suffering from PTSD and losing veterans to suicide. And then this is compounded on top of that. This is an issue that I think a lot of people don't understand or don't realize is going on.
No, that's exactly right. And frankly, our government doesn't even fully understand everything. And part of that is because we don't even fully understand everything that was burned in these burn pits. Literally everything was dumped in there, but no records were kept. The Department of Defense knew that this was a horrible way of dealing with it. Their own doctors and staff were telling them from the earliest days that these burn pits were going to make them sick, but it was easiest to just ignore that fact and to keep pushing on. And now we're paying the price. And so that's what we're really fighting for now, is government recognition that they were the reason why our service members are coming down with these illnesses, and that it's their responsibility now to provide them with health care and benefits.
Okay, so let's get into the legislation. It's called the Honoring Our Pact Act, and that's what you're pushing for. As it stands right now, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the burden of proof is put on the veteran. So if they're suffering with a medical illness, they essentially have to go to the courts and prove there's a direct link that they're suffering as a result of their time served. What would this legislation do to change that? Yeah,
you're exactly right. So currently, we have about 70 to 80% of the claims that veterans file with the VA for health care because of their burn pit exposures are being denied. So as 70 to 80% of the time, the VA is saying there's not enough proof, you gotta give me more data, make sure that we can know for a certainty that your illnesses were caused by your service overseas. And the burden of proof is on the individual veteran to do this, and too often the VA is denying them. So what this legislation would do, the Honoring Our Pact Act, it would take all of that burden off of the service member. It would say, hey, if you served in any of these countries, to include Afghanistan, Iraq, and a larger number of countries as well, and you come down with any of these 23 illnesses, we are going to assume that that illness was caused by your service in uniform. And so we're going to provide you with health care, and we'll provide you, if necessary, with disability benefits. And then the legislation goes further, and it says there's a lot that we don't know about these burn pits and their effects on the body. So we're going to continue to study it. And as new information is learned, as we realize that there are other illnesses and conditions that are probably linked to this burn pit exposure, we're going to add those to those list of presumptives as well. So that list of 23 illnesses will probably grow over time as we learn more about the effects that these burn pits have had on service members and veterans.
How long has this been in the works?
Years. And it's literally more than a decade now that groups, veterans groups, have been focused on this issue. Like I said, we've known about this from the earliest days of our time in Afghanistan and Iraq, that this was going to cause an issue, but it really has caught the public's attention in the last few years. And so there's been a number of bills that have come out over the years, some that have passed to begin to chip away at this problem. But this Honoring Our Pact Act is the largest, most comprehensive, most complete legislation to date. And that's why it's getting so much attention, because literally every single veterans group out there today is behind this. 65 of us sent a letter to the Senate saying the Honoring Our Pact Act is the legislation that you need to pass to finally take care of not just our post 9/11 veterans, but there's work in here that would also support Vietnam veterans that served outside of Vietnam in countries like Laos and Cambodia and Thailand, where they were also exposed to Agent Orange. It would finally bring health care to them as well. So that gives you an indication of how long veterans have had to fight for health care because of their government's denial that there's a connection between their service and the conditions they came down with later in life.
Yeah, these burn pits, I mean, they're not new and they're not specific to one location, right? I mean, it's widespread.
Exactly. No, it's widespread. It's not a new procedure in the military. I mean, the use of burn pits goes back probably since there was a beginning of militaries, and they had to burn things because you don't want to let them fall into enemies' hands. The uniqueness around the post 9/11 use of them, especially in Iraq and Afghanistan, is both the size and the breadth of things that were burned in these. You know, we now pretty much everything that comes to us, especially in a war zone, is wrapped in plastic or other synthetic materials that you're just not supposed to burn. I mean, there's a reason why open air burn pits have been banned in the US for decades. And it's because we know that they release horrible, noxious fumes that are going to cause this illness and to be sick and eventually to die. But these were wide open. These were not only approved, but this was the standard way of getting rid of things in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what we're talking about is, on our largest bases, we're talking about over 100 tons of waste a day that was burnt this way.
Wow. Jon Stewart has been in front of this for a while. He's very open about speaking about it. He's at several events. He was at an event over the weekend in Washington, D.C. as well. I want to play some of what he said.
We come out here today looking for the support of the American people. And what do we have behind me? It's veterans organizations. It's veterans. It's their families. This country can't be this broken. Do not tell me that you don't have the money to keep a promise that you made to the veterans. If we as a country can't take care of the people that take care of us, then we don't have much of a country.
What has it been like having someone like him be a spokesperson for this?
Yeah, having Jon Stewart on our side in this fight has been transformational. I mean, there's a direct connection between the work that he did to get health care for the 9/11 responders in Ground Zero in New York City. There's a huge connection between that and this work, and that's because they're very, very similar. You're talking about very similar health conditions that come down from those that served on the ground there at Ground Zero, and the things that are happening now from burn pits. And Jon Stewart has been transformational. He just brings attention to an issue in a way that no one else can. He's incredibly smart and talented in the way he talks about it. And you hear him just in those clips there. He's been absolutely amazing to have behind us. And I think he's really going to be the guiding light that gets us over the finish line here.
Yeah, he touched on the money part there. This passed in the House, but all House Democrats voted yes, and Republicans, 34 of them voted yes. So opposition from these lawmakers comes from the estimated cost over the $300 billion over the next 10 years and the effect it might have on the VA. They're already backlogged with medical cases. What do you say to that?
Yeah, those are false accusations. It's a reason to be against this legislation. One, the VA adamantly supports this. They want this legislation because not only is it the right thing to do, but part of the legislation also contains funding and direction to increase VA facilities around the country to make sure that we not only have more physical locations where veterans can be treated, but also increases the number of VA employees that can process our claims. So any indication, any statement by a member of Congress that says the VA won't be able to handle this, that's simply false. On the money side, it's also false because not only was this just keeping a promise that was made to veterans and service members, we were told when we raised our right hand that if anything happens to us when we're in uniform, our country will take care of us. And so all this is keeping the promise. But as Jon Stewart said, we always find a way as a country to find the money to send our members over to war, but we never take care of them when they come home. And that's exactly what's going on here. We have a Congress that not only passed a $700+ billion budget for the Department of Defense, but they decided that wasn't enough. They added on another $30 billion or so over and above what the Defense Department was even asking for. So they find money when it's a priority for them. And so that's what we're just trying to really drive home today, is that taking care of our veterans after they have served needs to be as much of a priority as it is when we send them overseas into harm's way.
Jeremy, 30 seconds left. This has been a long time coming. It moves on next week. What do you think will happen?
I think we're going to get there, but the way we do so, the way we ensure it happens, is by every one of your listeners reaching out to their senators, both of them, and tell them to vote yes on the Honoring Our Pact Act. It's actually going to have to go back to the House, for another vote because the Senate made some changes to it. They actually improved it. So it's not only your senators that are going to be voting on this, your representative is going to be voting on this as well. So we need everyone to reach out to their members of Congress and tell them to vote yes on the Honoring Our Past Act.
Okay, Jeremy Butler with IAVA, the CEO there. Thank you so much for your time and thank you for your service. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Christina. I appreciate you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll be back after this. You're watching Newsmaker Saturday.